Shocking new revelations into the potential origins of COVID-19 pandemic as a treasure trove of documents reveal plans by American and Chinese scientists to bioengineer COVID viruses in Wuhan. Documents obtained by Emily Kopp and outlet U.S. Right to Know reveal plans to engineer viruses with very similar properties to SARS-CoV-2, including a furin cleavage site and a whole host of other aspects in Wuhan, in fact. So this virus that brought the world to its knees had many of the same features that the scientists specifically sought clearance to do testing on, though the NIH had initially said it was simply testing viruses and viral characteristics already in public literature. In her report, Kopp writes, the new documents reveal that the scientists plan to use new reverse genetic systems and test viruses. In other words, to engineer live viruses with novel backbones. The documents describe the SARS-related viruses to be studied in the grant as posing, quote, a clear and present danger of a new SARS-like pandemic. She adds that early drafts of a grant proposal show researchers plan to test engineered spike proteins in these familiar backbones as an initial test that would help them prioritize genomes for the next step, the generation of synthetic viruses in 6 pieces. The spike proteins had, quote, pre-epidemic potential. That was a lot of scientific mumbo-jumbo, so joining us now to discuss further, translate some of that into English, is U.S. reporter with Right to Know, Emily Kopp. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Yeah, great to be here.
So we obviously like to have you on anytime there's even, a small amount of new information, but I took this to be, despite being very technical, kind of a significant finding that this proposal, I believe called the diffuse proposal, that they looked at in 2018 to do research on a coronavirus, and to give it elements that resemble the virus in the pandemic we came to know and love so very dearly. Go into this further, what this shows us about how these two things could have been connected.
Yeah, I mean, Robbie, as you laid out quite well, this is very technical, but important. And essentially the documents that I obtained are the meeting notes and early drafts of a proposal the year before the pandemic to engineer high-risk coronaviruses in Wuhan. And what they show is that while some key features of SARS-CoV-2 that made it into a pandemic pathogen, the worst pandemic pathogen in a century, while they are very rare in nature and we don't see them in related viruses, they were central to the esoteric research interests of the coronavirus experts working with the lab at the pandemic's epicenter. So if we want to get a little more specific and a little more technical, these documents are not a step-by-step manual for engineering SARS-CoV-2 precisely, but it gets us pretty close. And so their idea was to engineer novel spike proteins and use them to generate models and reverse genetic systems with which they could design the most dangerous SARS-like coronaviruses possible. And specifically, the two features they looked at are features that we see in SARS-CoV-2, specifically a furin cleavage site at the S1, S2 junction of the spike protein. This is really, above all else, the feature that supercharged SARS-CoV-2 into a virus that has infected virtually everyone on the globe. And they were also interested in receptor binding domains that could bind very well to a human receptor called ACE2. So in more plain language, essentially, they were screening for just the sort of spike proteins that we see with SARS-CoV-2, where it would be so good at infecting human cells that it would sort of take off immediately. And that's what we saw with SARS-CoV-2. And this we know because of private notes of virologists who favor the natural origin. This was a real red flag for them as well, that this could be a lab origin. It sort of posed a scientific paradox that the virus was able to sort of become pandemic capable so quickly. And so these proposals lay out a recipe for some of the most unusual aspects of the genome that have sort of been red flags for engineering from the very beginning. And the end goal was to engineer high-risk synthetic, in other words, high-risk lab-made coronaviruses. And the quote unquote gold standard, in the words of one of the American scientists involved, would be to identify viruses that could cause disease.
So just to be clear, the new documentation is about a grant proposal called the Diffuse Grant Proposal that was led by EcoHealth Alliance President Peter Daszak, but that this was a proposal that remained in the proposal stage. It did not go into effect, but we're saying that the existence of this proposal provides some background evidence of the kind of research that people at this lab were interested in and lays the foundation for the likelihood that COVID was lab made?
Yes, that's a important distinction. This proposal was rejected by the sought-after funding agency, DARPA. But the significance of these documents is really just to give us a window into the research interests of the scientists working most closely with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the documents I obtained also show that this work would be relatively cheap. For example, engineering the novel spike proteins would cost about $1,000 per spike protein. So while they were seeking millions and didn't receive those millions, this work could be done relatively easily. And in fact, that's a reason that they sought to work with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, is because it would cut costs.
And do we know, do we know anything about why the proposal was rejected by DARPA?
Yeah, so there is a letter that was obtained by the independent research group Drastic that indicates that DARPA was concerned about just the sort of things that concern us looking at it. Now in hindsight, they were concerned about the viral engineering work being conducted here. And keep in mind, the American scientists had actually misled DARPA into thinking that the high-risk work would occur in North Carolina and not in Wuhan. I reported on that a few weeks ago. So even thinking that all of this work would be going on in the US, they found it to be too risky, or at least according to this letter, that has not been, as far as I know, independently verified. But that is the reporting that's out there.
And just because the funding was not granted by DARPA doesn't mean the research wasn't being, they weren't forbidden to do it. And you said it's very cheap. I think Ryan Grimm, who used to co-host this show, has written about this or pointed this out. Sometimes you're doing research and then either you can apply for a grant to get that covered after you've already started it or something like that. Just because this proposal wasn't granted doesn't mean they weren't already exploring some of these scientific experiments.
Absolutely. And we know through other reporting from Catherine Ebon and others that the scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were under enormous pressure to produce. So it's possible that they took the ideas laid out by the American scientists and ran with it on their own independently under more lax biosafety standards. I also just wanted to briefly cover another sort of technical thing, if your viewers could bear with me. There's also been this claim that there is a smoking gun in the documents regarding something called restriction sites. These are slices of, or places where viral genomes can be sliced in the lab, but these restriction enzymes can also occur in nature. But scientists discovered in 2022 that a pattern of restriction sites seemed so unusual as to be improbable to have occurred in nature. And the documents that I obtained include a budget line for one of those restriction enzymes, these viral scissors that the scientists had flagged as being unusual in the viral genome. I don't know if that's able to be followed, but I just wanted to call that out. I think that requires some more research and some more debate among scientists, but it is an interesting lead in our documents as well.
Thank you, Emily. I'm really glad I took so many biology classes in college. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here.